Martin Pall. He's a PhD, Professor Emeritus, School of Molecular Biosciences, Washington State University. You have the program, which most of you have. He's got a long program, a long list of accomplishments. He's author of 40 scientific papers on oxidation and inflammation. He has a distinguished career, and he's now in his, quote, retirement. But he's focusing on the cellular mechanisms of action that explain the adverse biological effects of wireless devices on the human body.
You know, there's been this issue of how these low-intensity EMFs work, and of course, as you've heard, industry is claiming that it can't possibly work. And I sort of stumbled on this mechanism about 3.5 years ago, that it works by activating things called voltage-gated calcium channels. And so that's basically what my talk is going to be focused on. But there are many different health effects that can be explained through this mechanism. And so basically, so there's been this great puzzle, and that these EMFs are composed of low-energy photons, and Dr. Moskowitz already talked about that. And the energy per photon is too low to influence the chemistry of our bodies. And that's true, okay? People say that over and over again. And so then the question is, how can they influence our biology through non-thermal effects? That is, how can we have biological effects that are not just heating effects? And the safety standards, as you've already heard, assume that they cannot, okay? That only thermal effects need be considered, and that if there are no thermal effects, there cannot be biological effects. And yet we know there's literally thousands of papers in the scientific literature reporting biological effects of exposures well within safety standards. And none of these should occur if their arguments had any scientific merit. So anyway, so the solution to this was that EMFs show effects, and this was shown in 26 different studies, that are blocked by calcium channel blockers. Calcium channel blockers are drugs that are specific for blocking these voltage-gated calcium channels, or we abbreviate these VGCCs, so you're going to hear that. VGCCs a lot in my talk. And so, and let me just say there are 5 different types of these calcium channel blockers which have been used that work in different ways, and they all can block or greatly lower effects of EMFs. A lot of this work's been done in cell culture, but it's also been done, at least to some extent, in animal studies as well. Now, when the VGCCs are activated, what they do is so the VGCCs are in the plasma membrane, in the outer membrane of cells. Okay, so every cell has an outer membrane, a plasma membrane, and they're within that membrane, and when they open up, they allow calcium to flow into the cell. And the excess calcium in the cell is responsible for most, if not all, biological effects of these EMFs. And I'll show you various reasons to think that's true. This was originally published in this one paper that I published in 2013, and that was honored by being included in the Global Medical Discovery site as one of the top medical papers of 2013. And so there are a lot of other kinds of evidence in addition to the calcium channel blocker studies that argue for this mechanism, and I'm just going to go through these very quickly. There are something close to 1,000 studies reporting changes in calcium fluxes and signaling following microwave exposures. And let me just make one thing clear, which I haven't mentioned so far. It's not just microwave EMFs that work via the VGCC activation. It's also lower frequency fields, including the extremely low frequency fields that come from our wiring. Okay? So they all work on the same target. That doesn't mean they're equally active in working on the same target. The main concern for health issues at this point are the microwaves, because those are the things that are going up, you know, where our exposures are going up and up and up, okay? But that doesn't mean there aren't also concerns from lower frequency fields. And so The increases in intracellular calcium can occur almost instantaneously following EMF exposure. And this suggests that they work directly on activating the VGCCs. There are several properties that were studied with calcium channel blockers, and when there were several properties studied, they didn't just block one effect, but they blocked all the effects that were being studied. Okay, so that argues that this role is a very general one. It has a lot of different things. And I have to say, at this point in time, everything that I've seen in humans and in mammals that are produced by these fields can be explained as being caused by the VGCC activation. Now that may change, but at this point it seems to me this is the predominant mechanism that we have to worry about, and it may even be the only mechanism. So each VGCC has a voltage sensor. So this is a structure on it, on the molecule, which responds to electrical changes across the plasma membrane. And I think there are very good reasons to think that the electrical effects of the field are working directly on the voltage sensor, and that the structure of the voltage sensor is extremely sensitive to these electrical effects, okay? And I published this in a paper that earlier this year in Reviews in Environmental Health, and along with a lot of other things. So, and I calculated, let me just say that it's been known for, since around the time of World War II, that microwave fields and lower frequency fields can put forces on charged groups. So if you have a positive or negatively charged group on a structure in your body, you can put forces on those. And that's the way microwave ovens heat your food. Okay, so microwave ovens heat your food basically by joggling charged groups back and forth that are present in the food. That then heats up the food, and that's what cooks it. Okay, so this has been known essentially since the time of World War II. I calculate that the voltage sensor of this VGCC, and this is simply based on its physical structure and its location in the plasma membrane, is roughly 7.2 million times more sensitive to these electrical effects from the EMFs than are single charge groups that are elsewhere in the cell. So they are exquisitely sensitive, and I think that's why you get this activation, and why people have been claiming, oh, these fields aren't strong enough to do it. Now we know why that's wrong. Okay, the target is exquisitely sensitive. Okay, so anyway, that was published in this paper, and I'll go on from there. Okay, so this is a figure of the VGCCs, and if you look at that, those orange cylinders, those are alpha helices. They're part of a protein which is in the plasma membrane, and you can see a bunch of positively charged groups on that. And it's those four orange things that are the voltage sensor. And there are some things now actually we know that are different than the structure, but basically that structure is exquisitely sensitive for reasons that I really don't have time to talk about in any way here today, to these weak fields. And now, okay, so you have microwave and lower frequency EMFs, if you look on the left side there, and they activate the VGCCs. And what happens then is you get an increase in intracellular calcium, and that Ca2 plus I thing is the way intracellular calcium is designated in biology. And that increase in intracellular calcium then can have quite a number of effects, okay? And some of the effects actually are therapeutic, okay? So there are therapeutic effects, and I want to tell you how they work. But obviously the concern that we have are the pathophysiological effects, the damaging effects, and we'll talk about those in some detail. But the therapeutic effects work through nitric oxide, NO, which is, if you go from going from left to right there, you see NO is increased by increased intracellular calcium. Why? Because two of the enzymes that make nitric oxide are calcium dependent. So they're almost completely inactive when calcium levels are low in the cell. The increased calcium, you get huge amounts of nitric oxide produced. And there's a nitric oxide signaling pathway which goes along there through cyclo-GMP and G kinase. And that's what produces therapeutic effects. That's what I said in my first paper on this. That's what Arthur Pilla said in a paper that was published at almost exactly the same time. He's a real expert. He's worked on therapeutic effects for 40 years. So we came to very similar conclusions, not identical, but very similar conclusions at essentially the same time. Okay, so you get nitric oxide, and that can be therapeutic. But nitric oxide also reacts with something else called superoxide. And superoxide, you can see there, I think over here. It's also increased by intracellular calcium. Okay? And those two then react with each other to form peroxynitrite. That's what that ONOO minus is. Peroxynitrite is a very potent oxidant. It can do a lot of damage in the body. And one of the things it does is to break down to form a lot of free radicals, which produce a lot of damage. And you get then oxidative and nitrosative stress. I think all of those are involved in the pathophysiology in causing damage to the body, okay? But in addition to that, calcium signaling is extremely important in the cell. And if you've got too much of it, it causes lots of problems. And so there are calcium signaling effects that are excessive, that are also involved in producing this pathophysiology, okay? So basically, I think, this, and I'll say a lot more about this as we go on, this diagram here can explain a large number of different biological effects that have been reported to occur by low-intensity microwave fields. And so there are lots of health impacts that have been reported over and over and over again. The scientific evidence for these is very strong. Industry, of course, will deny it, and that's the way they keep busy, I guess. That's what the science says. Okay, so let's go on. And so I have a table here of various kinds of health effects and how they can be generated by this mechanism we just talked about. Okay, so the first is oxidative stress, and that was talked about by Dr. Moskowitz. And that can be generated by peroxynitrite and the consequent free radical formation. Somebody's got something to turn off there. Thank you. Okay, and you can get single-stranded breaks in the cellular DNA. I reviewed that evidence in my first paper, and I showed how there are known mechanisms by which these free radicals can attack the DNA and produce single-strand breaks. Whenever you have a lot of single-strand breaks, as you do in many of these studies, has been shown, you also get double-strand breaks in the DNA. Because anytime you have breaks on opposite strands that are near each other, they tend to fall apart and develop double-strand breaks. So those are produced by the same mechanism. Cancer undoubtedly involves those, but it also involves a number of other mechanisms. So these free radicals can also produce other changes in the DNA, including 8-nitroguanine, 8-oxoguanine, and those are all mutagenic, cause mutations. And so those can all be involved, all of these, single-strand, double-strand breaks, and these guanine changes can all be pro-mutagenic. They can cause, and when they produce changes in the somatic cells in the body, they can cause cancer. Now, I want to say this. What you will see claimed by industry people all the time is there cannot be a mechanism for these low-intensity relatively low-frequency fields to cause cancer. Okay, and that claim is just wrong. Now, let me give you some other evidence as to why it's wrong. There is a kind of carcinogenesis called inflammatory carcinogenesis. When you have inflamed tissues, they tend to develop cancer at much higher rates than non-inflamed tissues. And that process has been studied for a long time, and it works through peroxynitrite and these kinds of mechanisms. Okay, it's known to work via these mechanisms. So this mechanism can cause cancer and inflammatory carcinogenesis, and all I'm saying is it's basically the same thing for EMF exposures. Okay. Okay. So let's go on. This breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, that can be produced by peroxynitrite in the way that I've stated here. And I'm not going to spend the time to talk about all of these things. But male and female infertility, very important, as Dr. Moskowitz has already said. And there are known mechanisms by which this can produce male and female infertility. Therapeutic effects, again, we've talked about those, can go through the increases in intracellular calcium, the nitric oxide signaling pathway. There are diverse neuropsychiatric effects, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. But, you know, we know that the VGCCs have roles in releasing every neurotransmitter in the brain. So when you activate those VGCCs, so the VGCCs have very high densities in the neurons throughout the brain, throughout the nervous system. And so the nervous system from animal studies is the most sensitive organ in the entire body. There are many other organs that are affected, but the nervous system is particularly susceptible. And so it's almost inevitable when you have high levels of activity in the nervous system and these VGCCs, and you're activating them, you're going to get all kinds of effects. And those effects have been shown to occur in animal studies, extensive changes in the brain, and very horrendous ones. There are cataract formation, can be caused by VGCC activation and increased intracellular calcium. Let me just say, they have been claiming, the industry people have been claiming cataracts are caused by heating. They've been claiming that for well over 40 years. It's not true. There's a huge literature that shows that excessive calcium has an essential role in cataract formation. And there's also 3 studies which specifically tested the heating mechanism and came to the conclusion that that wasn't what was going on. So this is just a fiction. Okay, the last thing I want to say, there are cardiac effects. And my view of how those cardiac, and those have already been mentioned here, my view of how those cardiac effects occur is different from what seems to be the conventional view among others. In the heart, there are pacemaker cells. There are cells in the heart which regulate the beating of the heart, okay? Those pacemaker cells are known to have very high densities of VGCCs, okay? And the VGCCs are an important part of the pacemaker mechanism. So when you activate those VGCCs, it causes a direct effect on the pacemaking, and I think that's what leads to the cardiac effects, primarily, okay? You get, interestingly, both tachycardia, rapid heartbeat. You also get bradycardia, slow heartbeat. That sounds contradictory, but basically I think the one can actually lead to the other. And you get arrhythmias, and arrhythmias are associated with sudden cardiac death. We have an epidemic of young, apparently healthy athletes dying in the middle of an athletic competition. I'm sure you've read these news reports. Unexplained. Now, I don't have proof that this is what causes it, but I strongly suspect that that's probably what it is. It's probably EMF effects. And so as we introduce these EMFs in more and more situations, and we have them in Wi-Fi in the schools and so forth, then this will probably be increasing much more over time. Okay, so what? How can cancer be? Actually, I've already talked about this, so I guess I'm just going to go through it because I have a second thing on cancer, and I've already talked about this. Let me just say, talk a little bit about this middle paragraph, because that's something I have not talked about. The industry people argue that ionizing radiation, the individual photons are much, much more energetic than are the photons in microwaves and lower frequencies. And that is absolutely true, okay? And they argue based on that as, that these lower frequency fields, all they can do is heat things. And we've already shown why that's wrong. But what's interesting is, is that the mechanism of carcinogenesis from ionizing radiation actually has a lot of similarities to the mechanism of radiation that I just talked about through free radicals, okay? Both of them involve high levels of free radicals, okay? So when you have ionizing radiation producing cancer, the ionizing radiation is known when it's going through the cells of the body. It generates lots and lots of free radicals. And it's those free radicals, and that process is called Compton scattering. That was discovered by Arthur Compton, who got the Nobel Prize for this back in 1927. And so this has been known for a long time, and it's been shown, of course, more recently that these free radicals are involved in producing the cancer for ionizing radiation. So the mechanism of ionizing radiation exposure actually is not all that much different in causing cancer from the mechanism from EMFs, in my opinion. Okay, so let's go on. All right, so basically all the things we've talked about can be explained through this figure, and that's very important because it basically says, as far as we can tell, everything goes back to the VGCCs and the various effects that are produced by the VGCC activation. So, okay. Now, these are not the only pathophysiological effects that such EMFs can produce, but these are certainly among the ones that are best understood. But if you just look at those things in the table that we just discussed, what they tell you is that these microwave EMFs are attacking each of the four things that I think we most value as individuals and as a species. These are attacking our health, they're attacking our brain function, they're attacking the integrity of our genomes, and they're attacking our ability to produce healthy offspring. So that in and of itself tells you what kind of a horrendous situation we're looking at. But it turns out that when you look at these things more carefully, it actually becomes even worse than that. So what I've done is to talk about some worst case scenarios. So these are things that are perhaps not completely and absolutely demonstrated, but where there's strong evidence, and where I think that we have to worry about how they're developing. What the impact is on our society, and in fact on all societies around the world. The autism epidemic has been argued by 10 different research groups to be caused, to a great extent, by EMF exposures. And at the Autism One meeting last month, this is an old slide, sorry, several months ago, I discussed 32 types of evidence that support a pathway of action for these microwave EMFs. through the disruption of synapse formation in synapse development in the developing brain of autism patients. And so basically, what we're talking about here in this figure is that is the microwave lower frequency EMFs. They activate the VGCCs. They increase intracellular calcium. We've talked about all of that. And intracellular calcium has effects on 4 different mechanisms that are involved in the formation of the synapses. Actually, there's a 5th now that I know about. All of these are known to be regulated by calcium. All of these are known to be disrupted by excessive calcium. So if you have excessive calcium in the nervous system during the development, it's essentially inevitable that it's going to get screwed up. Okay. Now let me just say, I talked about 32 at the meeting. I talked about 32 different types of evidence that this pathway not only occurs, but that it's important in the development of autism. Okay. And so, for example, we know that excessive activity of the VGCCs can cause autism. Okay, we know that from rare mutations. We know that from a genetic polymorphism that elevated levels can cause an excessive susceptibility to autism. We know that there are many different effects on the nervous system, including synapse formation from animal studies and so forth. So there's a lot of different types of evidence that come into this. Okay, 3 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I got to go through these quickly. And okay, neuropsychiatric effects. I mentioned briefly before, and this had already been discussed by, I believe, both Dr. Russell and Dr. Moskowitz. This is from a paper I just published about 2 months ago that had quite a number of different neuropsychiatric effects caused by various kinds of microwave fields. Okay, so there are different kinds of fields, but they produce very similar effects in the body and in the brain, I guess I should say. They have massive effects, as I mentioned before, on the brain of animals. There are, by the way, widespread neuropsychiatric effects produced by a genetic polymorphism that produces elevated VGCC activity. Okay, so we have a lot of evidence from the biology that this is to be expected, and then when you find it from the epidemiology, and where the epidemiology itself argues for causality, it's a very, very strong argument. Okay, I guess I went through 2 minutes quickly. Okay. Anyway, there are 20 other kinds of neuropsychiatric effects that have been reported, but I don't think are sufficiently studied to say, okay, these are established. The others, I think, are clearly established. But the effects are quite tremendous. Okay, sterility, spontaneous abortion. Let me just say there was a fascinating study done on mice. It was published 17 or 18 years ago, where they took mating pairs of mice. They put them in what's called an antenna park, so a bunch of broadcasting antennas. The levels at ground level were all well within our safety standards. And what happens? The mice become sterile, completely sterile, in about 2 months in one location and about 4 months in the other location. 2 different intensities, okay? Complete sterility, okay, in a relatively short time period. All within safety standards, okay. So these are all things, can I just take about a half a minute and go through these others? There are genotoxic effects, which I believe can cause mutations in the germline. And I think there are strong arguments that we're looking at epidemics of premature dementias now, and they are probably caused by these EMFs as well. We know that calcium has a big effect on these. Okay, so basically that's what we're looking at. Potential for, number one, catastrophic decline in human fertility. Two, a large fraction of the babies who are born may suffer from deleterious mutation. Three, many of the babies are likely to develop autism basically because of the synapse effect. Four, those who were born and get through that are probably going to develop widespread neuropsychiatric effects. And five, those who survive to age 30 or so probably start developing early onset dementia. Anyway, thank you.